The red ships hung in space like hungry birds waiting for their meal, and Admiral Kethrin stood on his command bridge watching the small evacuation ships flee from the planet below, and his 4 eyes gleamed with satisfaction as another system fell to the Vexarian Empire without any real fight, and his tactical officer reported that 17 dreadnoughts and 43 cruisers plus over 100 support vessels were in perfect formation and ready for the final attack on the colonies. Below, the Vexarians had crushed 4 different alien races in just 4 years, and nobody had stopped them because the Galactic Council only knew how to talk and negotiate and send diplomatic messages, while worlds burned and Kethrin clicked his mandibles in pleasure knowing that soon Epsilon Prime would be just another conquered world, added to their growing empire. The sensor operator suddenly called out that a new ship was coming through jump space at the edge of the system, and it was alone, and Kethrin asked about the distance and type of vessel, and the operator said it was a single carrier about 3 kilometers long and coming from the outer system toward their position, and Kethrin smiled because he thought it was probably another council diplomat coming to beg them to leave and negotiate some kind of peace treaty. But when the ship fully appeared from jump space, the operator said it was not sending council identification codes, and nobody could identify what kind of ship it was, and Kethrin asked if it had weapons active. But the tactical officer said no weapons were charging, and no targeting systems were online, and the ship was just moving forward on basic thrust toward the Vexarian fleet. Kethrin laughed, because someone was sending one single ship against his massive fleet of 160 warships, and it seemed like a joke. And then his communication officer said there was an incoming message, and Kethrin told him to play it for everyone. To hear a human woman's voice came through the speakers calm and clear like she was discussing the weather, and she said, "This is Captain Helen Brooks of the Earth Carrier Defiance, and you have 60 seconds to begin withdrawal from this system, and this is your only warning." The entire bridge fell silent for a moment, and then Kethrin began laughing and all his officers joined in because humans were the newest members of the Galactic Council, and they had been begging for protection ever since they discovered how to travel between stars. And now one human ship was threatening his entire fleet. And it was the funniest thing Kethrin had heard in years. He opened a channel back to the human ship and told Captain Brooks that he had 160 warships and she had 1 ship, and she should go home and tell her leaders that the time for talking was over, and the age of Vexarian dominance had begun. No response came back from the human ship, but on the tactical display, the carrier began moving faster and accelerating directly toward the center of his fleet, and Kethrin asked if they should destroy it now, but then decided to let it come closer so they could vaporize it at optimal range and teach humanity a lesson about challenging the Vexarian Empire. The human carrier kept coming, and when it got within 300,000 kilometers, the sensor operator reported that it was launching something from its hangar bays, and Kethrin asked if they were fighter craft, but the operator said no. They appeared to be drones, and there were hundreds of them and then thousands of them spreading out into space, and none of them had weapons systems active. Kethrin ordered all ships to open fire and destroy the carrier and its drones before they could do whatever they were planning, and the entire Vexarian fleet fired at once, and plasma bolts and particle beams lit up the darkness of space and converged on the lone human ship. The Defiance shields glowed bright as they absorbed the first wave of fire, but no shield could stand against 100 warships firing together, and within moments the human carrier's shields collapsed, and the hull began to break apart, and atmosphere vented into space, and the engines went dark, and the ship stopped moving and became a dead hulk floating in the void. Kethrin ordered ceasefire and looked at the wreckage with satisfaction, and told his weapons officer to begin targeting the planet below, because they would start with the largest cities and make an example of Epsilon Prime for the entire galaxy to see. But then something happened that made every alarm on every Vexarian ship start screaming at once, because all the drones that the Defiance had launched suddenly activated their reactors at the same time, and they lit up like small stars across the entire battlefield, and every sensor in the fleet was overwhelmed by the power signatures. The tactical officer shouted that massive jump signatures were appearing all across the system, and ships were coming through from jump space, and Kethrin demanded to know how many ships were arriving, and the officer stared at his screen with wide eyes and said he could not get an accurate count because they were still coming through, and there were at least 300 contacts, and then 400, and then 500, and they just kept appearing. Catherine asked for identification, and the officer said all vessels were broadcasting human identification codes, and they were carrier groups and battle groups and dreadnought squadrons. And the officer looked up with terror in his eyes and said, the humans had brought their entire fleet. But that was impossible, because the council census said humans only had 40 warships total. And Catherine had verified that information himself, and yet his tactical display was lighting up with over 600 human vessels, all appearing at the edges of the system in perfect coordination, like they had planned this moment, for months or years. Another transmission came through, and it was the same female voice from before, but this time she was speaking from a different ship, and she identified herself as Fleet Admiral Helen Brooks. And she said that Admiral Catherine had been given 60 seconds to withdraw, but instead he had chosen to fire on the Defiance and kill her daughter, Captain Sophie Brooks, and her crew of 400 people. The human fleet began moving toward the Vexarian position, and their weapons were charging and their shields were at maximum power. And Admiral Brooks continued speaking and said the council had rules about warfare and proportional response and warning shots and negotiations, and humanity had followed all those rules since joining the galactic community. But the Admiral said those rules were not meant to protect humans from other species, and they were meant to protect other species from humans, because Earth had spent 10,000 years learning how to wage war against itself, and humanity knew exactly what it was capable of when the rules were removed. Admiral Brooks said Catherine had fired first and killed 400 of her people, and now he was going to learn why Earth needed those rules in the first place. And the human dreadnoughts began to glow as their main weapons charged to full power. Catherine shouted orders to his fleet to form defensive positions and target the human command ship and fire everything they had, and the Vexarian fleet responded instantly because they were veterans of many battles and they had never lost a major engagement, and they had the advantage of already being in defensive positions in the system. The human fleet accelerated toward them and launched thousands of fighters, and the space between the two fleets filled with weapons fire and explosions, and the sensor screens became almost impossible to read because of all the energy signatures and heat and radiation from the massive battle. Catherine watched his tactical display as Vexarian ships began reporting hits and damage and shields failing, and he could not understand what was happening because his ships were some of the most powerful in the galaxy, and yet the human fighters were cutting through his formations like they were made of paper. The battle lasted 11 minutes from first shot to final explosion, and when it was over, the entire Vexarian fleet had been destroyed, and not a single ship escaped, and Catherine's last thought before his flagship exploded around him was that humanity had been hiding in plain sight all along, waiting for someone to make the mistake of attacking them first. The silence that followed the battle was absolute and terrifying for every species in the galaxy that heard about it, because they realized that the friendly humans who smiled and traded and attended diplomatic functions had been warriors all along, and they had just been waiting for someone to give them a reason to show what they could really do. Commander Jake Peterson floated in the zero-gravity observation deck of the hospital ship Mercy and watched the salvage crews work in the debris field that used to be the Vexarian fleet, and Epsilon Prime hung in the distance with its blue and green surface scarred by the bombardment that had started before the human fleet arrived, but the planet survived and its 2 million people survived. Jake looked at his tablet and read the casualty report from Admiral Brooks, and the numbers made his chest feel heavy, because humanity had lost 6 ships destroyed and 14 damaged, and 412 people were dead, and 1,093 were wounded, and almost all the dead had been on the Defiance when it sacrificed itself to mark targets for the fleet. The Vexarian losses were complete, with every ship destroyed and no survivors recovered, and approximately 240,000 enemy personnel dead. And Jake closed his eyes and felt the weight of all those deaths settle on his shoulders, even though he knew the Vexarians had come to kill 2 million civilians. Medical Officer Lieutenant Karen Shaw came through the hatchway and told Jake that the council delegation was requesting permission to board. And Jake was surprised because the battle had only ended 7 hours ago, and the council usually took weeks to respond to anything. Karen said quietly that the council was scared because humanity had just destroyed the largest Vexarian battle group ever, assembled in only 11 minutes, and they had done it without even using their biggest weapons, because the engagement had been so one-sided that the human dreadnoughts never needed to fire their main cannons. Jake asked where the council wanted to meet, and Karen said Conference Room 3, and Admiral Brooks would attend through a hologram link from her ship. The council delegation consisted of 3 members, and they arrived looking nervous and uncomfortable. An ambassador. Zinthar was a tall, insect-like alien, whose eyes reflected the lights in strange patterns, and Counselor Veth floated in a tank of special fluid held up by gravity machines, and High Diplomat Ren looked like an otter from Earth, and he was the only one who seemed calm. They stood when Jake entered, but their body language showed fear and discomfort, and Ren thanked Jake for meeting with them and said they came on behalf of the Galactic Council to discuss the recent engagement at Epsilon Prime Admiral. Brooks appeared as a hologram at the head of the table wearing her full dress uniform, with all her medals from 30 years of service, and her face looked like it was carved from stone, and she greeted the council members coldly. Zinthar clicked his mandibles and said the council wanted to express condolences for the loss of the Defiance and its crew, and he said the Vexarians had acted without provocation and violated every treaty about warfare. But then he said the council was concerned about the nature of humanity's response. The complete destruction of the Vexarian fleet and the overwhelming force used and the speed of mobilization had caused alarm among all the member species, and Zinthar's antennae drooped as he spoke. Admiral. Brooks asked very quietly what exactly alarmed them, and Veth's translator bubbled to life, and he said that humanity had been a council member for only 5 years, and in that time they had presented themselves as peaceful and interested in trade and culture, and they had requested protection from the council defensive fleet. But now the council had witnessed over 600 human warships operating with coordination that suggested decades of training, and humanity had reported only 42 combat vessels in the official census, and Ren said gently but firmly that humanity had lied to the council. The room fell silent, and Jake held his breath, and Admiral Brooks leaned forward slightly and said that humanity did not lie, and they simply did not volunteer information the council did not ask for, because the census only asked about active military fleet, and humanity reported accurately, with 42 vessels on active patrol. Status Zinthar demanded to know about the other 558 ships, and Brooks said they were reserve fleet on inactive status and mothballed with crews on standby rotation. Brooks folded her hands and explained that for most of human history, her species had fought itself and built weapons that could crack continents and created delivery systems that could strike any target on their planet in under an hour, and developed warfare doctrine that cost billions of lives to perfect. When humanity discovered jump technology and made contact with the council, they learned the galaxy was different and wars were rare and conflicts were resolved through negotiation, and the species in the council had never experienced anything like Earth's world wars or centuries of constant brutal combat. Ren's whiskers twitched and he said, "So humanity hid its true capabilities," and Brooks corrected him and said humanity adapted to galactic culture and mothballed 90% of its fleet and focused on trade and diplomacy, and genuinely tried to be the peaceful species the council wanted them to be. But when the Vexarians began their expansion and started crushing civilization after civilization, humanity watched and waited and hoped the council would act. And Brooks' voice became hard as she said the council did nothing but talk while species died. Veth protested that the council did act with sanctions and diplomatic missions, but Brooks cut him off and said the council talked while species died and negotiated while colonies burned, and when the Vexarians came to Epsilon Prime with weapons aimed at 2 million civilians, the council was preparing another strongly worded resolution. Zinthar's antennae stood rigid, and he said so. Humanity took matters into its own hands, and Jake spoke up reading from his tablet and said that Article 7 of the Mutual Defense Charter allowed any member species to respond with appropriate force when their vessels were fired upon without provocation. The Vexarians destroyed the Defiance first, and humanity responded according to council law with appropriate force, and Ren said it was overwhelming force, but Brooks corrected him again and said it was appropriate force. The Vexarians brought 160 warships to slaughter. Civilians and humanity brought 600 to ensure they could never do it again anywhere. And Veth asked what humanity's intentions were now that they had revealed military capability that dwarfed any other member. Species Brooks was quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of someone who had lost her daughter 8 hours earlier, and she said, Humanity spent 10,000 years learning how to wage war and got very good at it. And in the process, learned that winning battles is easy, but building peace is hard. Humanity came to the stars hoping to never need weapons again, and the Vexarians took that hope away when they killed her daughter and 411 others while preparing to kill 2,000,000 more. Brooke stood and her hologram flickered and she said, humanity's intentions were simple, and they would defend council space and protect member species who could not protect themselves and hunt down what remained of the Vexarian Empire, and ensure they never threatened anyone again. When that was done, humanity would go back to mothballing ships and trying to be the peaceful species they wanted to be. But if another aggressor rose and another species decided the council's peaceful, nature made them weak. They would learn the same lesson the Vexarians learned. Humanity had rules about warfare, not because they were weak, but because they were not. And they knew what they were capable of, and knew what happened when they removed the restrictions. Brooks paused and said the question was not what humanity intended to do with its power, but what the council intended to do with theirs. And would they continue hiding behind diplomacy, while others suffered, or finally acknowledge that sometimes peace must be defended with force? The hologram disappeared, and the 3 council members sat in silence, and finally Wren turned to Jake and asked if he had anything to add. Jake thought about Sophie Brooks, who he had known since she was a junior officer, and thought about the 411 others who died because someone had to send a message and draw a line and say that enough was enough. He said quietly that the Defiance was a volunteer mission, and Captain Brooks and her crew knew it was one way, and they knew their job was to mark targets for the fleet, and they did it anyway because someone had to go first and show the Vexarians that humanity was willing to pay the price. Jake stood and walked to the window, looking at the debris field, and said, that was what humanity brought to the council, and they were willing to pay the price and willing to go first and willing to do what must be done. So others did not have to. The council could join humanity in that mission, or continue as before, but either way humanity had chosen its path, and they would protect the weak, even if it cost them, and stand against tyrants, even if they stood alone. Zinthar rose slowly and said he would carry their message to the council, but could not predict the response, and he paused at the door and said, in all his years of service he had never seen such single-minded purpose, and humanity frightened the council because they did not fight for territory or resources, but for principles. Jake asked if that was good or bad, and Zinthar's antennae drooped, and he said he did not know, but suspected the galaxy was about to find out. The news of the Battle of Epsilon Prime spread across council space at light speed, through quantum communicators and jump-capable courier ships, and within days every species in the galaxy knew what happened and how the Vexarian Empire that had been undefeated for 4 years of conquest had been annihilated by a species that joined the council. Less than a decade ago, Lieutenant Commander Alan Price sat in the intelligence briefing room aboard the Earth Station Sentinel Watch, reviewing the flood of communications his team had intercepted, and as the head of signals intelligence for the human military, his job was to listen to what other species said when they thought humans were not listening. What he heard terrified him, because the galaxy was not celebrating humanity's victory, and they were not thanking Earth for stopping the Vexarians, and instead they were afraid, and that fear was spreading like a virus through every civilization in council space. Alan told his assistant, Ensign Claire Martinez, to play Intercept 77 Alpha, and the speakers crackled with a translated conversation between 2 alien merchants recorded at a trading station, 3 systems from Earth. The first merchant asked if the other had heard that humans slaughtered the entire Vexarian fleet at Epsilon Prime, and the second merchant said that was war and such things happen. But the first merchant said, no, you do not understand, because they did not just win but annihilated 160 ships in 11 minutes with no survivors and no prisoners. The second merchant paused and said, perhaps the Vexarians deserved it because they destroyed many worlds. But the first merchant said, consider this, and the humans have been among us for 5 years, smiling and trading and attending diplomatic functions, and all that time they had 600 warships hidden away waiting. What else were they hiding, and what else were they capable of? And the merchant said the humans came from a world where they spent thousands of years killing each other and built weapons that could destroy their own planet. And now they were here in the galaxy with a military that made the Vexarian Empire look like children. The recording ended, and Alan rubbed his temples and asked Claire how many intercepts had similar themes. And she checked her tablet and said approximately 60% of all civilian communications they monitored in the past 72 hours showed the same pattern. The IBOA galaxy was scared of humanity. And Alan said it quietly, like saying it soft would make it less true. And Claire agreed and said, "Yes, sir, they are scared of us." Alan stood and walked to the observation window, and Sentinel Watch orbited humanity's first colony world, New Horizon, and below he could see the lights of settlements peaceful and orderly, and ships carrying trade goods and colonists coming and going. He said quietly that humanity saved 2 million people at Epsilon Prime and stopped an empire that was butchering entire civilizations, so why were they afraid of humanity? And Claire joined him at the window and said because the council species had been at peace so long they forgot what war really looked like. To them, humans were not liberators, but a reminder that the universe was not as safe as they thought. And Alan told her to play the next intercept. This one was from an alien military channel, with 2 officers discussing fleet readiness, and the first officer said the Admiralty wanted updated assessments of human military capabilities, but the second officer said that was difficult because humans operated with information security they had never encountered. Human ships used quantum encryption they could not break, and military networks were completely isolated from civilian infrastructure. And the first officer asked if they could estimate based on what happened at Epsilon Prime. The second officer said they could try, and initial analysis suggested humans developed fighter tactics centuries ahead of standard council doctrine, and their ships appeared to use modular weapon systems that could be reconfigured for different missions, and their coordination suggested training levels associated with species that had been spacefaring for thousands of years, not decades. The first officer asked if humans were a threat, and after a long pause, the second officer said humans were an unknown, and unknowns were always threats. Alan closed his eyes and felt the weight of those words, and this was the nightmare scenario the diplomats had warned about because humanity joined the Galactic Council, hoping to find friends and allies and partners in exploring the stars, but instead they were becoming the monster in everyone's nightmares. Claire said they had another intercept and this one was different, and Alan needed to hear it right away. The recording came from a colony world on the edge of former Vexarian space, and it was a mining outpost that had been preparing for invasion when news of Epsilon Prime arrived. One voice asked if it was true that humans destroyed the Vexarian fleet, and the other voice confirmed yes, and they saw the tactical data, and it was complete annihilation, and the first voice said, "Then we are saved because the Vexarians will not come here now and they will fear human retaliation." But the second voice said, "Perhaps. But what happens when humans realize they can dictate terms to anyone they want? And what happens when they decide they want the mining rights and trade routes and worlds?" The first voice protested that humans would not do that because they fought for council principles, but the second voice said, "So they claim now, but power corrupts, and it always does." Alan turned away from the window and told Claire to get Admiral Brooks on Quantum Comm using Priority Channel 10. Minutes later, Brooks' face appeared on his screen, and she looked exhausted with dark circles under her eyes, and the past week had aged her a decade. Alan said he had been monitoring galactic communications since the battle, and humanity had a problem, and he summarized the intercepts and the fear spreading through civilian and military channels, and how humanity's victory was being reframed not as rescue but as threat. Brooks listened in silence, and when he finished she was quiet for a long moment and then said, "So we saved them. And now they fear us, and that is quite the cosmic joke." Alan asked what her orders were, and Brooks said keep monitoring because she needed to know if any species was considering preemptive action against humanity. And then she asked if in all his research of galactic history, he ever found a species that successfully transitioned from warrior culture to peaceful council member. Alan said no, Admiral, but no species like humanity ever joined the council before, and humans were unique. Brooks laughed bitterly and said unique, and humanity was terrifying because they were a species that spent 10,000 years perfecting the art of killing each other, and now they were loose in a galaxy that forgot what that meant. Alan said humanity stopped the Vexarians and saved millions, But Brooks cut him off and said this time, yes, but what about next time, and what about the time after that? She leaned forward and her face filled the screen and said, Alan, I killed my daughter and not directly, but I ordered the mission and sent Sophie to Epsilon Prime, knowing it was one way, and told myself it was necessary, and someone had to draw the line and the galaxy needed to see humanity would pay any price to protect the innocent. Her voice cracked and she asked if she was right or did she just prove to the galaxy that humans were willing to sacrifice their own children for strategic advantage, and that humanity would do anything and pay any cost to achieve victory. Alan had no answer, and Brooks said again to keep monitoring, and then told him to start preparing contingency plans because if the Council turned against humanity and decided they were too dangerous to remain free, then humans needed to be ready. Alan asked ready for what, and Brooks said, ready to survive. Because if the galaxy decided humanity was the new Vexarian Empire, they would come with everything they had, and this time humans would be the ones outnumbered. The screen went dark, and Alan sat alone in the intelligence center listening to the whispers of a frightened galaxy and wondered if humanity made a terrible mistake. Outside the window, New Horizon turned serenely with its oceans reflecting starlight, and ships moved between orbital facilities in orderly patterns, and everything looked peaceful. But Alan knew better, because he spent his career studying warfare and understanding the patterns that preceded conflict, and what he was seeing now in the fearful communications of 100 species was the beginning of something humanity hoped to leave behind on Earth. They brought their capacity for war to the stars, and now they would learn if they could survive the consequences of being the most dangerous species in a galaxy that valued peace above all else. Alan returned to his monitors and continued listening to the galaxy's fear and began writing contingency plans for a war he hoped would never come, but knew might be inevitable, because sometimes the greatest threat was not the enemy you fought, but the ally who feared what you might become. The intercepts continued through the night, and each one added another layer to the picture forming in Alan's mind, and it was a picture of a galaxy on edge and species whispering in dark corners about the human threat and whether something should be done before humanity decided to use its power for conquest instead of protection. He filed report after report and sent them up the chain of command, and knew that somewhere in Earth's military headquarters, other people were reading the same data and coming to the same conclusions. Humanity had won the battle, but the war for acceptance and trust had only just begun, and it was a war that could not be won with weapons or tactics or superior firepower. 3 weeks after the Battle of Epsilon Prime, the Galactic Council convened an emergency session on the neutral world of Concordia, and the massive chamber built to accommodate the wildly different body types of Council species hummed with nervous energy, and representatives from 47 civilizations gathered, filling the amphitheater with colors and sounds and chemical signals that created a sensory storm. Ambassador Kate Morrison stood in the human delegation box with her hands clasped behind her back to hide their trembling, and she had been humanity's representative to the Council for 3 years, spending countless hours in boring committees and diplomatic receptions. But this was different, because this was Judgment Day Council. Speaker Thresh was an ancient alien whose fur had gone silver with age, and he activated the chamber's central hologram, and it displayed the tactical recording of the Battle of Epsilon Prime, showing the Defiance entering the system and launching its drones and dying under Vexarian fire. Then came the arrival of the human fleet and the 11-minute battle and the complete destruction of the enemy, and the recording played 3 times in total silence, while every representative watched. Thresh finally said that members of the Council had gathered to address the matter of humanity's military actions at Epsilon Prime, and the floor was open for discussion. The alien representative from the insect species was first to speak, and his antennae vibrated with agitation as he said his people wanted to commend humanity for defending Epsilon Prime, because 2 million lives were saved, and this was not in question. However, he continued, and his voice became sharper, and the human fleet demonstrated capabilities far beyond what was reported in Council census data, and this represented a fundamental breach of trust, because how could any member species feel secure when humanity hid such overwhelming force? Murmurs of agreement rippled through the chamber like wind through grass, and another representative whose body floated in a tank of glowing fluid said furthermore the speed and coordination of the human response suggested they had been preparing for large-scale military operations. Since joining the council, what other preparations had they made and what other capabilities remained hidden? And the representative demanded to know. Kate raised her hand requesting permission to speak, and Thresh nodded, and her microphone activated. And she said, "Honored members, humanity has violated no council laws because the census requested information about active military forces, and humanity provided accurate data with 42 vessels on active patrol. The rest of the fleet was in reserve, status and mothballed according to internal policies," and she kept her voice steady, despite hundreds of alien eyes fixed on her. The floating representative interrupted and said it was a technicality, because humanity knew the spirit of the question. And Kate asked, because when other species reported military strength, did they include every civilian ship that could potentially be armed in emergency? Did they count every citizen who could be drafted into service, and where exactly was the line between active military and potential military? And she looked directly at the representatives as she spoke. Another alien rose from his seat, and this one looked reptilian. And his name was Sark, and his species had been neutral throughout the Vexarian expansion, and he said he would like to understand humanity's decision-making process. When the Vexarians threatened Epsilon Prime, humanity could have called for council support and requested assistance from member fleets, but instead, they acted alone. And Sark asked why Kate had prepared for this question and rehearsed her answer many times. But standing here facing the assembled representatives of galactic civilization, the rehearsed words felt empty and hollow. She said quietly, because by the time the council mobilized 2 million people would have been dead. And she reminded Sark that his species had been advocating for council military reform for 20 years. Sark had submitted proposal after proposal to streamline defense response, and every single one had been voted down because member species could not agree on command structure, or rules of engagement or force allocation. The Vexarians did not care about debates, and they came to Epsilon Prime with genocide in mind, and humanity could act immediately. So they did. A crystalline being whose voice rang like bells said that by acting unilaterally, humanity set a dangerous precedent, because if any member species could deploy military force without council approval, then there was no collective security and only chaos. Kate countered and said humanity had survival, because she asked the council directly if they had called for support. How long would mobilization have taken? And she asked hours or days, or weak. Silence answered her, because they all knew the truth. And Kate continued and said humanity acted to defend innocent lives and followed council law regarding proportional response, and used appropriate force against a hostile fleet that fired first. If humanity was to be censured for this, then what message did that send, and did it mean member species should stand idle while others were slaughtered, and that following law mattered less than maintaining comfortable illusions about galactic peace? Thresh raised a hand for silence and said, "No one questioned humanity's right to defend council citizens, but surely they understood the fear their actions generated, because 47 civilizations saw a species that hid 600 warships and deployed them with terrifying efficiency. They wondered what else humanity was hiding, and they wondered if today's defender might become tomorrow's conqueror." Kate took a deep breath, because this was the moment she dreaded, and she said she understood their fear, but let her tell them about humanity's fear. She pulled up a data file on her tablet and projected it to the chamber displays and said, "This is a list of every major conflict in human history for the past 3,000 years, and wars that killed millions, and technologies designed for nothing but destruction, and weapons that could sterilize planets. Humanity did all of that to each other long before they ever left their homeworld." And the chamber fell absolutely silent. Kate said when humanity joined the council, they hoped to leave that history behind and mothballed their weapons and focused on exploration and trade, and tried to be the peaceful species the council wanted them to be. But the Vexarians reminded them that the universe does not care about hopes, because evil still exists and tyranny still exists, and sometimes the only answer to violence is superior violence. She looked around the chamber, meeting as many eyes and optical sensors and compound lenses as she could, and said the council wanted to know what else humanity was hiding, and the answer was nothing. This is everything, and humanity has 600 ships and highly trained crews and centuries of tactical doctrine, and they showed The galaxy, everything they were capable of, and yes, it was frightening, and it frightened humans too. Kate's voice softened, and she said, humanity did not want to be warriors and did not want to be the galaxy's enforcers, but they would not stand idle, while innocents died, and would not debate proper procedure while colonies burned. If that made them dangerous, then so be it, and they would rather be dangerous and save lives than peaceful, and watch civilizations fall. She sat down suddenly exhausted, and the debate continued for 6 more hours, with species after species rising to voice concerns or demand explanations or offer support. One group proposed restrictions on human fleet deployment, and another suggested mandatory inspections of human military facilities, and a third called for humanity to submit to council oversight of all military operations. Finally, as the station's artificial sun began to set through the massive windows, Thresh called for a vote. The question before the council was, should humanity face sanctions for actions at Epsilon Prime, and all in favor were told to indicate. Now Kate watched the voting display with her heart pounding, and green lights meant yes, and red meant no, and amber meant abstention. The board, filled with colors and green and amber and red and green and amber and red, and the pattern seemed random and chaotic. When the tally finished, the result was 30 votes for sanctions and 12 against and 5 abstentions. Kate felt something collapse inside her chest because they had lost, and 30 species believed humanity should be punished for saving lives. But Thresh held up a hand and said the motion required a 2/3 majority to pass, and 30 votes out of 47 was insufficient, so the motion failed. Relief flooded through Kate, followed immediately by worry, because they survived the vote but barely, and 30 species wanted humanity punished. Thresh said, however, the council could not ignore these concerns, and he proposed a compromise where humanity would submit to voluntary military transparency measures. Humanity would provide regular reports on fleet status and deployment and training exercises, and would allow council observers at major military facilities, and in exchange the council would formally recognize humanity's right to maintain and deploy defensive forces, as they saw fit. Kate stood and said they needed time to consider this proposal, and Thresh said of course, and they would reconvene in 1 week. But he urged Kate to accept because the alternative was growing mistrust that would poison humanity's relationship with the council for generations. The session adjourned, and Kate left the chamber and immediately contacted Admiral Brooks. Through secure quantum channel, Brooks' face appeared grim as always and said she watched the session, and it was well done, but Kate said they almost lost with 30 votes for sanctions. 6 months after the Battle of Epsilon Prime, Lieutenant Sam Collins stood on the observation deck of humanity's newest military station, Guardian Post 7, and watched a council inspection team tour the facility, and the team consisted of 3 species, including a military analyst and a security officer and a diplomat serving as observer. The transparency measures had begun 3 months ago, and every human military installation now hosted council observers, and every fleet movement was logged and reported, and every training exercise was documented in exhaustive detail. It was humiliating, and it was necessary, and it was working because slowly, the fear that had gripped the galaxy was beginning to fade. Sam's communicator chimed and told him he was needed in the command center, and he arrived to find Admiral Brooks on the main view screen broadcasting from the Dreadnought Washington in orbit around Earth. And with her were Ambassador Morrison and a younger man in civilian clothes. Brooks said, "This is Daniel Foster from the Human Strategic Studies Group, and he has news that affects everyone." Daniel activated a holographic star map, showing council space, and red indicators marked dozens of systems along the former Vexarian border. He said over the past 6 months they had seen a significant decrease in raids and attacks along the frontier, and Vexarian remnant forces had largely gone to ground. But more importantly, they were seeing something unexpected. He zoomed in on a cluster of systems and said these colonies that had all been targeted for Vexarian expansion were now organizing mutual defense pacts and pooling resources and training militias and establishing early warning networks. They were learning to defend themselves, and Sam said it was because they saw what humanity did at Epsilon Prime. Daniel agreed partly, but also because they watched what happened after, and they saw the council debate sanctions against humanity, and watched humans accept transparency measures, and watched humanity prove that military strength did not automatically mean imperial ambition. Daniel smiled slightly and said, "Humanity scared the galaxy, but then showed them that fear was not necessary, and that strength and restraint could coexist." Brooks leaned forward and said the council had noticed, and Speaker Thresh sent a private communication yesterday, wanting to discuss establishing a rapid response force and a joint military structure that could deploy to crisis zones quickly without weeks of debate. Sam asked skeptically if the council would actually create such a force, and Morrison admitted probably not quickly, but the fact they were discussing it at all represented a fundamental shift. 6 months ago, the council could not agree on anything military, and now they were at least acknowledging the old system did not work. Brooks nodded and said, "Humanity was making progress slowly, but it was happening, and the galaxy was learning that humans could be trusted with power, and more importantly, other species were learning. They needed to be able to defend themselves. Humanity could not be everywhere," and Morrison added, "did not want to be everywhere." Sam was asked for his assessment of the council observers, and he thought about the analyst who spent hours reviewing tactical databases, and the security officer who attended every briefing, and the diplomat who seemed more interested in the human crew's daily lives than military procedures. Sam said they were learning, and not just about capabilities but about how humans think, and they were beginning to understand that humanity was not hiding plans for conquest in databases, and humans were just a species that took defense seriously. Brooks said exactly, and that understanding was spreading and humanity had gone from existential threat to cautious partner in 6 months. And that was progress. But Morrison warned it was fragile, and one misstep, or one overreaction to a crisis, could lose everything they built. The conversation continued for another hour, discussing deployment schedules and training protocols and diplomatic initiatives. But Sam found his mind wandering to something his instructor at Naval Academy said years ago before first contact. Captain Lewis had told the class that a warrior's greatest victory was the battle you win without fighting. Humanity fought at Epsilon Prime and won decisively and brutally in a way that shocked the galaxy. But the real battle came after, and it was the battle to prove they were not monsters and could wield terrible power responsibly, and that strength and morality were not mutually exclusive. That battle was not over, and perhaps would never be over, and perhaps this was humanity's role in the galaxy, to be the species that remembered how to fight but chose not to, except when no other choice remained. The meeting ended and Sam returned to his duties reviewing supply manifests and crew rotations, and it was routine work that kept a military station functioning. Through the observation window he could see the council inspection team boarding their shuttle, and the analyst gave what might have been a wave, and the security officer nodded respectfully, and the diplomat pressed his hand against the window in a gesture that meant goodbye in their culture. Small moments and small gestures, but they meant something, because they represented trust. Slowly building, Sam's communicator chimed again, and an incoming transmission from Epsilon Prime was requesting to speak with Admiral Brooks, and Sam patched it through. A human face appeared on the screen, older and weathered with the look of someone who spent decades on frontier worlds, and she said, "This is Governor Linda Hayes of Epsilon Prime, and she wanted to thank Admiral Brooks personally for what her people did 6 months ago." Brooks said, "No thanks were necessary, because humanity did what any council species should have done." Hayes smiled and said, "Perhaps, but humans were the ones who actually did it," and she said Epsilon Prime was erecting a memorial in their capital city, New Landing, and it would honor the crew of the Defiance and all those who died protecting them. Hayes invited Brooks to the dedication ceremony, and Sam saw Brooks' expression shift as grief she carried for 6 months surfaced briefly before she controlled it. Brooks said she would be honored to attend, and Hayes said they knew Brooks lost her daughter on the Defiance and knew the sacrifice she made, and Epsilon Prime would never forget. The transmission ended, and Brooks sat silently for a moment, then noticed Sam watching. She asked if he ever wondered if they did the right thing, and Sam said every day. Admiral Brooks said good, because the day they stopped questioning themselves was the day they became what everyone feared they were. And she straightened in her chair and told Sam to carry on. When the next crisis came, and it would come, he should remember that humans were not just warriors, but guardians, and there was a difference. The screen went dark and Sam stood alone in the command center surrounded by the quiet hum of equipment, monitoring 100 systems. Outside stars wheeled slowly across the viewport, and somewhere out there, species that feared humanity 6 months ago were beginning to trust them. And somewhere colonies that faced annihilation were rebuilding under protection of the fleet that saved them. And somewhere in the wreckage of the Defiance, still drifting, in orbit around Epsilon Prime, 411 names were etched into memory as a reminder of what it cost to defend others, and why that cost was worth paying. A lone human carrier had entered orbit, and silence followed. But from that silence, something new emerged, and not just fear, but respect, and not just power, but purpose. Humanity came to the stars as strangers and revealed themselves as warriors, and now slowly and painfully they were becoming something else, and they were becoming protectors of a peace they did not create, but would defend with everything they had. The galaxy would never forget the Battle of Epsilon Prime, and neither would humanity. But perhaps in time they would remember it not as a day of death, but as the day the silence ended, and a new voice spoke on behalf of those who could not speak for themselves, a voice that said, "We are here, and we are ready, and we will stand between you and the darkness, no matter the cost." That was humanity's promise to the galaxy, and they would keep it, because that was what Guardians did. Sam watched the stars and thought about the future and about the species humanity was becoming, and about the responsibility that came with being the most dangerous civilization in a galaxy that valued peace. It was a heavy burden, but humanity would carry it because someone had to, and because 411 people had died to prove that some things were worth fighting for. The observation deck was quiet except for the soft hum of life support and the distant sound of crew members going about their duties. Outside the window, a transport ship docked at the station and workers began unloading supplies, and the routine of military life continued as it always did. But Sam knew that nothing was truly routine anymore, because humanity had changed the galaxy and the galaxy had changed humanity. They were no longer the newcomers hoping to fit in, and they were no longer hiding what they were capable of. They were guardians now, and that meant something, and it meant everything. Sam returned to his station and continued his work and waited for whatever came next, because in a galaxy full of uncertainties, one thing was clear: humanity would be ready.